Hi everybody, tonight I'll be sharing a story that follows a quiet, winding path through the sands of ancient Egypt, a tale not of queens and pharaohs, but of a young girl whose life changed the day she was chosen for the inner courts of the royal palace. Her journey begins in a reed-woven village by the Nile, where the river runs slow and the days move with the hush of the wind. As she is drawn into the heart of the palace, we will follow her thoughts, her quiet observations, and the subtle, soft edges of a world that rarely reveals itself to those outside its golden walls. This is a tale of stillness, of secrets behind linen curtains and the breathless hush of evenings scented with myrrh. Let us begin. The Nile sang in murmurs, and the wind moved in soft spirals over the river reeds. Boats carved narrow paths across the shining water, their sails swelling like the breath of the gods. On the southern bank, where the earth was redder and the houses were made of mud bricks, smoothed by generations of touch, there lived a girl named Rania. Her world was the sound of birds nesting in papyrus, the weight of the morning baskets on her head, and the songs her mother hummed while grinding barley at dawn. Rania was the second daughter of a netmaker, a man who spoke little and measured his love in long silences and rough pats on the shoulder. Her mother had once been a singer in a temple further north, her voice silken and low, but the years and children had thinned it to a soft rustle, like fabric brushing over stone. They lived in a square house with 2 rooms and a shaded courtyard where a sycamore tree bent low, offering a small patch of coolness even in the fiercest heat. Rania liked to lie beneath it in the late afternoons, her eyes half closed, her fingers trailing in the dust as she listened to the world breathing. She had long limbs, curious eyes the color of old bronze, and hair that curled under the heat like river reeds drying in the sun. She did not know she was beautiful in the way the court understood beauty, quiet, serious, watchful. She only knew she loved the river. It was under that same sycamore tree that she sat when the royal boat arrived, bearing a woman whose sandals glinted like fish scales and whose scent carried before her, sweet and sharp like date wine left in the sun. The woman was wrapped in linen so fine it clung like mist. Her voice was warm, careful, and low as she spoke to Rania's mother, and her eyes rested on Rania longer than anyone else's ever had. Later, after the woman had left and the dust had settled in her footsteps, Rania's mother told her what the visit meant. The court was seeking new girls to serve in the House of Flowers, the secluded wing of the palace where the concubines and attendants of the Pharaoh lived. Her name had been chosen. Her appearance, her manner, the softness in her speech, these had pleased the royal eye. Rania did not cry, though her younger brother wept and clung to her skirts. She sat under the sycamore that night, the stars washing her skin in silver light, and tried to imagine a life beyond the bend of the river, beyond her father's hands weaving nets in the lantern glow, beyond her mother's voice calling her name across the dusty courtyard. The morning of her departure was cool. A breeze had slipped in from the desert, carrying the scent of sand and distant myrrh. She was dressed in a fresh linen tunic, her hair oiled and braided, her arms adorned with tiny blue beads from the village's only trader. Her mother pressed a folded piece of woven cloth into her hand, a token, a blessing, a farewell, and her father lifted his hand in a slow wave as the boat slipped from the bank. The river seemed to carry her gently, not like a current, but like a cradle. The further they drifted, the more the sounds changed. The birds grew quieter, the boats larger, and the banks more crowded with tall palms and stone walls. Rania leaned over the side of the boat, watching fish dart below the surface, their shadows flickering like whispers beneath the water. When the palace first appeared on the horizon, she thought it a mirage. Its towers shimmered in the heat, its walls the color of sand rubbed smooth by time. As they drew closer, she saw people, men in white kilts, women with trays balanced on their heads, guards standing with spears that glinted in the sunlight. The boat passed under a stone arch, and she felt the shade fall over her shoulders like a cloak. Inside the palace, the world changed again. The air was scented with lotus and frankincense. Coolness rose from the polished floors. The halls whispered with footsteps, and everything moved with a hush, as though the walls themselves were listening. A woman met her at the dock, a figure dressed in lavender linen, her head shaved and her eyes lined in kohl. She introduced herself as Citra, the keeper of new arrivals. Citra spoke softly as she led Ranya through the corridors, past chambers where veils fluttered like wings and laughter echoed from behind screens. She explained the rules with the gentle rhythm of someone who had repeated them many times. Speak only when addressed. Eyes lowered. Learn quickly. Listen more than you speak. And above all, be still like water. Ranya nodded, her heart quiet but alert. She took in every curve of the mosaic floors, every shape carved into the walls. She was shown to a small room with pale curtains and a sleeping mat, and a basin for washing. A woven rug lay on the floor like a garden of blues and reds, and beside the mat stood a chest carved with birds in flight. It was more beauty than she had ever seen in one place, and yet it felt like the edge of something vast, an unknown she could not name. That first night, she lay awake long after the oil lamp had burned out, her hands resting on the cloth her mother had given her, still folded beside her heart. Outside, the wind moved through the papyrus like a secret being told from one leaf to another. And in the quiet of that room, so far from the red earth of her village, Ranya listened to the silence of the palace and waited. The morning in the palace did not arrive with rooster calls or village chatter, but with the soft brush of sandals across stone and the faint rustling of fabric like petals moving in still air. Ranya opened her eyes to the scent of rosewater drifting through the curtains. Light poured into her room in golden strips, filtered through finely carved shutters. It cast delicate shadows on the walls, patterns of lotus blossoms and reeds. Her limbs were slow to stir. The mat beneath her felt softer than the earth she was used to, and the silence around her pressed gently on her senses. She sat up carefully, remembering that she was no longer in her mother's house, no longer a girl of the riverbank. She was something else now, though the shape of it had not yet fully formed. Citra returned just as the morning light began to soften. She wore a fresh wrap of linen that glowed faintly as she stepped through the doorway. Her presence was neither stern nor affectionate. It held something in between, like a river that does not show its depth at first glance. "Come," she said. "There is water for washing and others waiting." Ranya followed silently, her bare feet cold on the smooth tiles. They passed through corridors where other girls were already beginning to stir, some adjusting their tunics, some whispering softly. They were all young, like her, perhaps a few seasons older or younger, but their eyes spoke of the same mixture of wonder and uncertainty. The bathing chamber was a room of soft echoes in pale stone. Pools of clear water shimmered in its center, surrounded by low stools and bronze bowls. Attendants moved gracefully, offering oils and cloths without speaking. Ranya dipped her hands in the water, then her face, the coolness drawing a breath from her chest she hadn't realized she was holding. It smelled faintly of lilies. She washed in silence, watching the other girls through lowered eyes. Each carried her own stillness differently, some with practiced poise, others with nervous hands and darting glances. A few seemed already at ease, their movements fluid, their hair braided in the intricate style of the court. Ranya's own braids were simpler, held by the blue beads her mother had given her. She chose not to remove them. After bathing, they were led to a long, shaded hall lined with cushions and polished benches. This was the gathering place, where each day began. Citra stood at the head, her voice even and calm as she addressed the girls. "You have been brought here not only for beauty," she said, "but for patience. The House of Flowers is not loud. It is not hurried. You will learn the art of stillness, the grace of the eye, the silence that speaks without sound. You are not yet concubines. You are not yet attendants. You are seeds." The girls listened, some with wide eyes, others with faces carefully blank. Ranya listened too, but more with her body than her ears. The way the air moved around the words, the rhythm of Citra's speech, the spaces between each sentence. It reminded her of her mother's temple songs, measured, steady, layered with meaning beneath the melody. The rest of the morning passed in instruction. Older women guided them through simple postures, how to sit with one's back long and hands resting like petals. They learned how to pour water without spilling, how to offer a tray with quiet elegance. Ranya watched everything closely, mimicking the movements with care, her eyes absorbing details like cloth soaking up oil. By midday, the heat pressed against the walls, and they were given bowls of lentils, figs, and flatbread served with mint. The girls ate in near silence, their voices kept low. Conversation here was not forbidden, but it flowed gently, like water through narrow channels. That afternoon, Rania was taken aside by a woman with lined cheeks and eyes like dry riverbeds. Her name was Nefret, and she oversaw the personal refinement of each girl, how they moved, how they walked, how they held their gaze. "Let me see you walk," she said, her voice like brushed linen. Rania walked slowly across the room, unsure of what to show. Nefret watched her not with criticism, but with stillness. "You walk like someone who listens," she murmured. "That will serve you." Nefret taught her how to shift her weight with grace, how to breathe from her center, how to make silence feel full rather than empty. Rania practiced with the same focus she once gave to threading reeds through her father's nets. Every movement, every pause had purpose here. Days passed in quiet rhythm. The girls woke, washed, listened, learned. They were taught to play simple melodies on the lyre, how to grind coal and apply it with a light hand, how to weave garlands of lotus and jasmine. They learned the names of the gods whispered in temple songs, the stories hidden in the stars above the palace roofs. They learned to smell the difference between myrrh and frankincense, between crushed mint and bruised basil. Rania began to forget the sound of goats in the morning, the feel of the sun on the river's edge. But she remembered the blue beads in her hair and the folded cloth beside her sleeping mat. She unfolded it sometimes at night, not to use it, but simply to touch it. Its scent, faint and fading, was her anchor. One evening, as the sun dipped below the stone walls and the palace bathed in golden hush, Citra summoned Rania to the inner garden. It was a rare thing to be called alone. The garden was hidden behind veils of vines and soft curtains. Pools reflected the light of oil lamps. Birds nested in carved alcoves, and the air was thick with the scent of flowering trees. "You are ready to serve," Citra said, "but not yet chosen. The Pharaoh's eye has not yet turned to this wing." Rania did not speak. She watched the way the shadows danced on the water. "Until that day comes, you must continue," Citra said. "Even silence must be practiced." She placed a small vial in Rania's hand. Inside it was oil, amber-colored and rich, its scent both sharp and deep. "For the days ahead," she added, before disappearing into the folds of the garden. Rania stood there for a long time, the vial cradled in her palm, the fragrance rising like memory. The stars began to appear one by one, like thoughts surfacing in a still mind, and the garden, hidden from the world, held its breath. The nights in the House of Flowers moved like silk over skin, cool, smooth, and barely noticed until they had passed. Rania came to know their rhythm, how the shadows stretched long across her chamber, and how the hush deepened after the lanterns were snuffed one by one in the corridors. In those hours, she often lay awake, listening to the quiet breaths of the palace. Some nights she heard soft music, distant and hesitant, as if someone played only for the stars. Her body began to change with the discipline of the palace. Movements that once felt foreign now slipped easily from her limbs. She carried trays with precision, poured tea with grace, braided her hair in the style of the temple dancers without the tremble of nervous fingers. Her voice, once quick and full of river song cadence, had softened into the measured calm the elders preferred. She had not been chosen, not yet, but she was being shaped, slowly, carefully, like clay kept damp beneath cloth. One morning, a new girl arrived. Her name was Tia, and she came from the desert edges, where the wind scours the land into dunes and the sky is blinding in its emptiness. Her skin was golden brown and her hair long and unbound. She walked with a slight limp, the result of a childhood injury, and when she smiled, it was with both her mouth and her eyes. The other girls watched her with quiet caution, unsure what to make of someone who still carried the wildness of open space. Rania watched too, but with a different kind of attention. She remembered her own first days, how strange it had felt to sit among silk and shadow, to fold herself into the silence of marble walls. And so she offered Tia a seat beside her during the evening lessons and guided her hands during the garland weaving. Tia, in turn, whispered desert songs under her breath when the tutors weren't listening, and shared bits of dried fig from her hidden pouch. There was something unfiltered in her presence, a breeze stirring the heavy air of the palace. but it was not disruptive. It was soothing in a way that reminded Rania of water running over stone. Their friendship grew quietly like ivy on a shaded wall. They spoke in fragments between lessons, shared stolen glances during meals, and sometimes exchanged stories in whispers during the twilight hours when even the lamps dared not burn too brightly. Tia spoke of sandstorms and jackals, of her mother who read omens in the shape of vulture feathers, of nights spent sleeping under stars so sharp they seemed to cut the sky. Rania spoke little of her home. Her memories came not as stories, but as feelings. The weight of warm earth, the smell of ground barley, the sound of her brother's laughter as he chased chickens across the courtyard. She held them inside like tiny flames, too precious to release into the cool air of the palace. One afternoon, the girls were summoned to the water hall for a lesson in fragrance blending, a task considered both art and skill. The master of perfumes, a thin man named Mena, with fingers stained from years of oils and resins, lined the benches with trays of ingredients. Crushed petals, dried roots, rare barks, powdered resins, all arranged like the pieces of a puzzle yet unsolved. "You must not simply mix," he said, his voice a dry hum. "You must listen. Each scent has its own spirit. It will tell you when it does not belong." Rania worked slowly, her fingers guided more by instinct than memory. She mixed myrrh with orange blossom, added a hint of cinnamon bark, then a breath of lotus. When she brought it to her nose, she paused. It smelled like the river at night, like her mother's embrace after grinding herbs. It was not the most complex blend, but something about it felt whole. Tia leaned close to smell it and gave a soft sigh. "That reminds me of sleep," she said. Mena passed behind them and inhaled with a thoughtful tilt of the head. He did not praise, but neither did he critique. That was praise enough. Later that evening, Rania placed the small vial of her blend beside the one Citra had given her. She uncorked both and let the scents mingle in the air. One was sharp and noble, the other familiar and quiet. Together they filled her chamber like memory brushing against future. Life in the palace did not change in sudden turns. It shifted like sand, almost unnoticed. Yet something in Rania began to settle. She no longer watched every step or weighed every word. Her silences became richer, not born of fear, but of choice. And in that stillness, her presence deepened. One morning, a summons came, not from Citra, nor from any tutor. A guard in a blue sash appeared at the entrance of the House of Flowers and spoke her name with the weight of stone. "Rania," he said, "you are to serve in the Eastern Garden this evening." It was a quiet honor, and all the girls knew it. The Eastern Garden was not just for beauty. It was where the Pharaoh sometimes walked in the final light of day. Those chosen to serve there were seen, not always spoken to, but seen nonetheless. Tia squeezed her hand in passing. "You'll do well," she said simply. Rania prepared with the care of a weaver knotting the first threads. She bathed in water laced with hibiscus, wore a robe the color of pale dawn, and tied her hair with a cord of braided flax. The vial of perfume she had blended was dabbed lightly behind her ears. The garden was different in the evening, quieter than she expected, but filled with subtle life. Frogs chirped near the lotus pond, bees made their last pass through the blossoms, and the shadows of the papyrus trees swayed gently like dancers too tired to move with force. She was shown her place by an elder attendant. A small table of fruit and chilled wine was placed nearby, and she was to remain still, hands folded, eyes lowered, unless addressed. She stood beneath a flowering acacia, her breath even, her thoughts distant. The light turned honey-colored, and the garden began to soften at its edges. Then footsteps, not hurried, measured, calm. She did not look up, but she felt the change in the air, the way the stillness grew deeper. Whoever it was stopped nearby, paused, then moved on. A voice, low and smooth like a note drawn long from a lyre, spoke to one of the guards. "Who is the girl with the flax cord?" "She is called Rania, my lord, from the southern banks." A quiet hum in response, no further words, and then silence again. But in Rania's chest, something had shifted, just slightly, like a reed parting for the wind. That night, the silence in Rania's chamber felt different. It was not the gentle hush she had grown used to, not the comforting stillness of sleep waiting just beyond thought. It was sharper, more alert, like the moment before rain touches dry earth. She lay on her mat with her eyes open, tracing the patterns of shadow and light cast by the oil lamp. Though no words had been spoken to her directly, the memory of that voice, the low, deliberate tone, and the way it had paused after her name settled into her bones. She had not lifted her gaze. She had not dared. But she had felt the weight of presence, a gaze that passed over her as one passes over a field in bloom, pausing for the hint of a fragrance, the shimmer of hidden color. It was enough. The next day unfolded with the same calm order. Nothing changed, and yet everything had. The other girls, perhaps sensing something subtle in the way she moved, were quieter around her. Tia noticed the shift, of course. She always did. "You were seen," she said while sorting blossoms for garlands. "And when one is seen, something begins." Rania did not reply, not because she disagreed, but because she could not find the words that fit. Being seen in the palace was not a singular moment. It was a thread barely visible that could be followed or lost at the whim of the wind. In the following days, she was summoned more often. Once to serve wine in the sun court, once to assist in preparing the incense for the temple rituals. These were quiet tasks, performed in silence, but always in spaces where she had never been before. Places where high voices discussed matters she did not understand, and footsteps echoed with importance. Her time with the other girls remained, but now her hours were divided. She missed the long afternoons spent weaving with Tia, missed the small, odd secret smiles they exchanged during dull recitations. But she did not speak of this. She let the days carry her. One afternoon, Citra came to her chamber. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence held more gravity than usual. She stepped inside and examined the room without a word before sitting on the cushion near the window. "You are being observed," she said finally, "not just seen." Rania felt her chest tighten slightly. "By whom?" Citra did not answer immediately. She watched a moth circle near the lamp flame before continuing. "That is not always revealed. What matters is how you carry the attention. Do not reach for it. Do not run from it. Let it be drawn like smoke to air." Rania nodded, unsure if the gesture was even noticed. Citra stood, smoothing the folds of her robe. "You may be asked to attend a private gathering. If that request comes, accept it without question. Say little. Be as you are." Then she left, the scent of jasmine clinging to the air behind her. Days passed, then weeks. No further summons came beyond her usual duties. The rhythm returned, but now with an undercurrent, an unspoken waiting. Rania did not ask questions. She folded linens, arranged scrolls, assisted the older women in preparing rosewater compresses. And each night she sat in her chamber as the lamp burned low, wondering what it meant to be watched by someone you could not see. Then, on the evening of a new moon, a messenger arrived. He did not wear the garments of the palace, but something finer, dark linen embroidered in gold thread, sandals of pale leather, and a medallion that bore the seal of the royal inner court. He spoke her name softly, without announcement, as though it were a secret only he had been entrusted with. "You are to come," he said. "Now, bring nothing." Rania followed him through halls she had never walked before. They were darker, narrower, lined with heavy tapestries and guarded alcoves. No voices reached them here, only the echo of their steps, and the occasional rustle of a curtain stirred by unseen air. They stopped before a pair of tall doors, carved with the symbols of lotus and falcon. The messenger knocked once, waited, then stepped aside. A different figure opened the door, a woman older than Citra, her face lined deeply, but her bearing upright and graceful. She said nothing, only gestured. Rania entered. The room beyond was lit only by oil lamps suspended from bronze hooks. Their glow cast moving shadows across the painted walls. A soft mat lay at the center, surrounded by low cushions, and incense coiled like fog from a burner shaped like a lion's paw. A voice, familiar now, came from the far side of the room. "You were the girl by the acacia tree." Rania bowed her head. "Yes, my lord," she said, her voice steady. The pharaoh, though not wearing the crown or the ceremonial robe, stepped into the light. He wore a simple wrap of white, his wrists bare, his eyes sharp and quiet. "You did not look up," he said. "Why?" She hesitated, choosing her words. "I was told not to, unless addressed." He smiled, but it was not unkind. It was the smile of someone unused to being surprised. "And yet you heard me." Rania nodded. "Good." He moved to one of the cushions and gestured for her to sit. She did so, careful, poised, as she had been taught. He watched her for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he asked, What do you remember most from your village? The question caught her by surprise. She had expected silence or perhaps ceremony. But this was like water in her cupped hands. My mother's grinding stone, she said slowly. The sound of it at dawn, and the way the river moved at night like it was breathing. He seemed to consider this. Then he stood and approached a table where a bowl of dates and a pitcher of wine had been laid out. He poured 2 cups. You may speak freely in this room, he said, but not foolishly. He handed her one of the cups. Their fingers did not touch. She took the cup, her heart still but full. That night, they spoke of small things. He asked about the scent she wore. She told him it was her own blend. He inquired about her hands, why they bore the faint calluses of a net maker's daughter, and she gently asked nothing in return. When she left the chamber, guided once more by the silent messenger, the sky above the palace had begun to pale with the first light of dawn. The eastern horizon was a faint breath of silver. She walked back through the corridors with her eyes lowered, not because she was told to, but because she was not ready to let the night leave her. The days following that night unfurled in quiet precision, as though the palace itself had taken a breath and chosen not to exhale. Rania resumed her duties with the same calm she had always carried, her posture steady, her voice quiet, her hands deft in the tasks assigned to her. But something within her had shifted, subtle, inward, and firm like the root of a tree deep beneath the surface. She did not speak of the meeting to anyone, not even to Tia. The memory of it lived in a space too delicate for words, like silk kept wrapped in sealed cedar chests. The Pharaoh's questions echoed in her thoughts at odd moments, in the hush between chants during lessons, or as she folded a corner of cloth with practiced grace. His eyes, dark and measuring, had not left her mind, though they had only looked at her directly for a short time. 2 days passed, then a third. On the 4th morning, she was summoned again. No words accompanied the request. A folded piece of linen bearing the royal emblem appeared on her mat at dawn. Inside was a single phrase written in delicate script, "This evening as before." Rania bathed in silence, her thoughts slow and drifting. She chose the same pale robe, the one the color of dawn mist, and bound her hair with a ribbon of fine cord. She dabbed her wrists and collar with the blend she had created, the one that reminded her of riverbanks and memory. There was no excitement in her chest, nor dread, only a stillness, a waiting. That evening, she walked the familiar yet secret path once more, guided by the same silent messenger. The corridors were as shadowed as before, their silence deeper than any she had known in the outer palace. The door opened for her, again without a word, and the same older woman nodded her through. Inside, the chamber had changed slightly. The oil lamps were fewer, casting a dimmer light. A table now held thin papyrus scrolls and a tray of figs sliced with careful precision. The pharaoh was already seated, barefoot, wearing the same plain linen, as though royalty had been set aside at the threshold. He did not rise when she entered, but gestured for her to sit. "I've read of your region," he said. "The southern banks, red earth, narrow reeds, strong nets. It is not a land of leisure." "No, my lord," Rania replied, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "But it is a land of rhythm," he continued, "of patience and waiting, like the river, never still, yet never hurried." She did not respond, sensing the words were not meant to be answered. He lifted one of the scrolls and held it for a moment. "Do you read?" "No, my lord." He nodded, unsurprised. "Few in the House of Flowers do," he said, "but that can be changed." He set the scroll aside and picked up a date, rolling it between his fingers before setting it down again untouched. "I do not ask for beauty alone," he said. "I seek quiet, understanding, a mind that listens before it speaks." Rania met his gaze for the first time, slowly, cautiously. There was no softness in his face, but no cruelty either. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, but perhaps wearied by it. In his presence, she felt not fear, but clarity, as if the air around him was thinner and more exacting. "You do not ask questions," he observed. "No, my lord." "Why?" "Because I am not yet meant to." He tilted his head slightly, then nodded, almost approvingly. "You will return here twice each moon," he said. "For now, you will remain in your quarters. You will speak to no one of this." "I understand. I believe you do." He looked past her then toward the hanging lamp. Its flame fluttered, casting long shadows that stretched and swayed across the floor. "You may go." She stood, bowed once, and left the chamber. The air outside felt cooler than before, and the silence of the corridor welcomed her like an old friend. When she returned to the House of Flowers, the courtyard was quiet, the lanterns dimmed, and the other girls already at rest. She moved through the halls like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarked. In her chamber, she lay awake for a long time, her hands folded over her chest, her gaze tracing the ceiling's faint contours. She thought not of power or position, nor of what might lie ahead. She thought of the way the Pharaoh's words curled in the air before they reached her, the pauses he let hang like suspended chords in music. He was not a man who needed to speak often. His silence was a language in itself. In the morning, life resumed as always. Rania wove garlands, stirred rose oil into bathing water, and watched as new girls were brought into the house. One was from the coast, pale and wide-eyed. Another from the north, with a voice too loud for the quiet halls. The elders would shape them as they had shaped her. Tia returned to her side during a quiet moment and offered a piece of honeyed bread wrapped in fig leaf. "You've been still lately," she said, not accusing, just observant. Rania took the bread, breaking off a small piece. "Stillness suits some better than others," she replied. Tia smiled. "And for you?" Rania did not answer, only placed the bread in her mouth and let the sweetness melt against her tongue. As the sun climbed higher and the soft chants of temple priests echoed faintly from across the palace walls, Rania folded herself into the rhythm once more. She was not different on the outside. She was not marked or adorned, not called by any title. But something had taken root within her, something quiet and strong. And like all things grown in silence, it was beginning to bloom unseen. The sun had begun its slow descent over the walls of the palace, casting long shadows across the courtyards and bathing the stone corridors in honeyed light. Rania moved through the hall of incense with a small tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, the scent of cardamom and burnt orange drifting upward in quiet ribbons. Around her, other girls whispered softly, their voices like the breeze in tall grass, but none addressed her directly. There was something about her presence now, still gentle, still humble, but touched by a difference they could not name. In the days since her second meeting with the Pharaoh, Rania had returned to her rhythms with even greater subtlety. She did not seek attention, nor did she withdraw. She became part of the palace's breathing, seamless and smooth. Her hands were as careful as before, her gaze as lowered, but within her there was a kind of anchoring, a rootedness that had not been there in her early days. She had begun to understand the quiet power of listening. That afternoon, Citra summoned her to the far garden. It was a smaller space, walled off from the main courtyards, where olive trees bent low with age and narrow canals threaded between stone paths like slender veins of water. Citra stood beneath a flowering fig, her hands folded in front of her. "You have been requested for lessons," she said without preamble. "Reading, poetry, and history. You will meet with the priest scholar Menkau once each week after your duties are completed." Rania bowed her head in acknowledgement. "You may not speak of this with the others," Citra continued. "These lessons are for your mind only, not for their ears. I understand. Do you?" Rania looked up briefly and met Citra's gaze. The woman's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. They searched her face as if measuring something more than comprehension. "Yes," Rania said softly. "I do." Citra gave a small nod, then turned and disappeared down the garden path, her sandals soundless on the stone. That evening, Rania met Menkau. He was unlike anyone she had encountered in the palace. Tall, thin, with skin like river clay, and eyes that seemed always to be reading something even when nothing was written. His robes were worn, stained with ink and oil, and his fingers were long and lined with age. He sat cross-legged on a cushion surrounded by scrolls and tablets, and when Rania entered, he did not look up immediately. "Sit," he said at last, his voice deep and dry. She did, folding her legs beneath her as she had been taught. "You know the signs?" he asked, tapping a tablet with his knuckle. "No, teacher," he grunted softly, not in disappointment, but in familiarity. "We begin with names," he said. "Not yours, the names of gods, the names of winds, the names of time." And so her first lesson began. The glyphs were beautiful and strange, curves and angles that held meaning in their silence. Menkau traced them in the air with his ink-stained fingers, and Rania followed, copying their shape into the dust with the tip of a reed. Her progress was slow but deliberate. She was not quick, but she remembered. Over the following weeks, her lessons deepened. She learned the phases of the moon as recorded by the priests of Thoth, the lines of verse carved into the temple walls along the river, the way a single symbol could change meaning when paired with another. She learned the words for silence, hesh, nek, each with its own shade of meaning. One for obedient silence, one for attentive listening, one for the hush of sacred spaces. Menkau did not praise her, nor did he scold. He simply continued, each lesson a thread added to the tapestry she did not yet fully see. Meanwhile, life in the House of Flowers pressed on. Tia remained close, though Rania now spent less time among the other girls. They met in moments between duties, in corridors heavy with perfume, in corners of the garden where shadows pooled. Tia never asked about her absences. Instead, she offered quiet presence, a shared breath, a glance that held unspoken understanding. "You move like someone who knows where the water is," Tia said one evening as they arranged freshly picked marigolds. "Even in a dry season." Rania smiled, folding a stem between her fingers. "I only listen." "Then you listen well." That night, Rania dreamed of the river, not the palace garden stream, but the wide, breathing current of her home. She stood on its edge, the sky wide and red above her, and her mother's voice called from across the water. But when she looked, the shore was empty, and only the wind answered. She awoke with her heart beating gently, not in fear, but in longing. The folded cloth her mother had given her remained beneath her mat, untouched. She pulled it out and held it close, pressing it against her cheek as the first light of morning crept over the chamber walls. Another letter arrived that day. This time no linen fold or formal seal, a single line scratched into papyrus, delivered by a servant whose eyes never met hers. "Tomorrow, the second hour of night. Come alone." She burned the note after reading it, as instructed. The following evening, when the hour arrived, she walked the shadowed path again. This time, her feet moved with certainty. The corridor did not feel unfamiliar, nor did the heavy door. She was greeted by the same older woman, though the gesture this time was warmer, more knowing. Inside, the chamber had been altered. The oil lamps had been replaced by low stone basins filled with scented water and floating petals. The mat at the center was larger, softer, surrounded by woven screens painted with scenes of the Nile, the sunboat, the sacred birds, the fisherman with his net. The Pharaoh stood near the far wall, his back to her, gazing at the painted surface as if reading from it. "Rania," he said, not turning. "My lord," she answered. "Do you know the tale of the lotus who sang?" "No, my lord." He turned then, his face unreadable. "Then tonight you will hear it." He gestured toward the mat, and she knelt, her hands resting lightly on her lap. He began to speak, not as a ruler, but as a storyteller. His voice was low, deliberate, and rich with rhythm. The story was simple. A lotus who opened each night to sing beneath the moon, whose song was never heard by the gods because they had turned their faces away. But one night, a wandering spirit heard it, and the moon paused in its path to listen. And when the gods heard the silence where the song had once been, they realized they had missed something rare. Rania listened, her breath slow, her eyes half lowered, the words falling around her like the petals from the painted screens. When the tale ended, he did not speak again. He simply watched her, and she felt the weight of being seen, not as a servant, nor even as a chosen one, but as a presence, whole and unadorned. Then, without a gesture, he turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the fragrance of the water and the quiet weight of the story. Rania remained there long after his departure, her hands resting still, her mind circling the lotus's song. The days that followed moved without haste, as if the palace itself had become aware of her stillness and matched its pace to hers. The sky over Thebes glowed with pale fire each morning, and in the House of Flowers, the rhythm of routine swept gently through the halls. Bowls of scented water laid out before sunrise, linen robes aired beneath fig trees, soft footfalls echoing in quiet succession. Rania walked among the other girls with the same poised grace, her hands as careful as ever, her speech no more frequent than needed. But within her, something unfolded with each breath, as if a story had begun to write itself along the edges of her soul. The tale of the lotus who sang lingered in her thoughts like incense caught in cloth. She found herself listening more deeply to the sounds around her, the hush of footsteps, the murmur of bees in the garden, the low rustle of wind over sandstone. Each sound seemed to carry meaning, as if some ancient voice whispered just beneath it. Minkau, the priest scholar, noticed the change. At their next lesson, he placed a fresh scroll before her, its fibers still rough, its ink dark and smelling faintly of cedar. On it were verses not of gods or kings, but of river folk, fishermen, washerwomen, children who ran barefoot through lotus fields. Not all wisdom belongs to marble, he said, sitting beside her. Even the reeds speak if you know how to listen. Rania traced the symbols slowly, aloud, her voice low. She stumbled on several glyphs, paused, then corrected herself. Minkau did not interrupt. When she reached the final line, she set the scroll down. The river remembers even the footsteps of birds, she murmured. Minkau looked at her then, eyes softened by some emotion he did not name. You read like someone who knows what it is to be remembered, he said. She offered no answer. She simply nodded and set the scroll aside. That evening, as she passed the courtyard where the older attendants gathered to spin thread and hum songs of the old dynasties, she caught a phrase from one of the lullabies. He who listens to silence walks with gods. The words struck her not with their sound, but with their stillness, as if she had been meant to hear them at just that moment. In the moon's next turning, she was summoned again. The note came not in the hand of a servant this time, but as a folded flower, an actual bloom, white and faintly fragrant, left on her mat before dawn. Tucked within its petals was a single ivory bead. She knew, she prepared. That night, the chamber was different once more. The walls had been draped with deep blue linen, and copper lamps had been lit with oil that burned with a soft green hue. The space was warmer than before, yet quieter. There were no scrolls, no trays of fruit, only two cushions facing one another beneath a canopy woven with stars. The Pharaoh stood as she entered, his back straight, his expression unreadable. You've been reading, he said. Yes, my lord. And listening? Always. He gestured for her to sit, then took his place across from her. For a time, they remained in silence. He watched her, but not with the distance of royalty. There was a kind of searching in his gaze, not for answers, but for depth. He reached for a small vessel and poured them both a dark infusion that smelled of hibiscus and anise. When she took the cup, their hands did not meet, but the space between them felt changed, no longer ceremonial, but known. I once believed that only the bold earned a place near the throne, he said. But boldness is loud. It fills the room with itself. It leaves no room to listen. Rania took a sip, the warmth curling in her throat. And now I find myself waiting for silence to teach me. He leaned back slightly, letting the shadows of the canopy play across his face. There are many in this palace who know how to speak, he said, but few who know how to remain. You do not try to hold the moment. You let it unfold. She placed her cup gently on the mat and looked at him. I was taught that nothing held too tightly survives the summer heat, she said softly. A flicker of amusement crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the early shape of admiration. Not the desire for a face or a form, but for the interior space that rarely reveals itself. You have not asked me what I want of you, he said. I will know when I'm meant to. His gaze held hers longer now. And if I want nothing, then I will still serve. He fell silent again, and in that hush, something shifted in the air. Not power, not submission, but recognition, the kind that moves between two people when no roles are required. He rose slowly and crossed to a small table she had not noticed before. Upon it lay a simple object, a reed flute, carved with the symbol of Ma'at, the goddess of balance. This was mine when I was a boy, he said, before I was Pharaoh. He held it out to her, not to keep, but to touch. She reached for it, fingers brushing its smooth, time-worn surface. It was warm, not from the room, but from the memory it carried. Play, he said. I do not know how. Then let the silence play through you. She lifted it to her lips, unsure, and let out the gentlest breath. A soft, broken tone emerged. Not music, not yet, but not noise either. She tried again. The sound was clearer, fragile like new silk. The Pharaoh listened with his eyes closed. When she stopped, he opened them again. You have known the shape of silence, he said. Now you will learn its song. He took the flute from her hands and set it back upon the table. Then, without ceremony or gesture, he turned and departed, leaving her once more with the echo of words not spoken. She sat beneath the canopy long after he had gone, her fingers curled slightly, as though the reed still rested there. And in her chest, something very old and very new began to stir. Not desire, not ambition, but understanding. She had been given a space to fill, and she would fill it with quiet, with presence, with the music of stillness. The days that followed moved without haste, as if the palace itself had become aware of her stillness and matched its pace to hers. The sky over Thebes glowed with pale fire each morning, and in the House of Flowers, the rhythm of routine swept gently through the halls. Bowls of scented water laid out before sunrise, linen robes aired beneath fig trees, soft footfalls echoing in quiet succession. Rania walked among the other girls with the same poised grace, her hands as careful as ever, her speech no more frequent than needed. But within her, something unfolded with each breath, as if a story had begun to write itself along the edges of her soul. The tale of the lotus who sang lingered in her thoughts like incense caught in cloth. She found herself listening more deeply to the sounds around her, the hush of footsteps, the murmur of bees in the garden, the low rustle of wind over sandstone. Each sound seemed to carry meaning, as if some ancient voice whispered just beneath it. Menkau, the priest scholar, noticed the change. At their next lesson, he placed a fresh scroll before her, its fibers still rough, its ink dark and smelling faintly of cedar. On it were verses not of gods or kings, but of river folk, fishermen, washerwomen, children who ran barefoot through lotus fields. Not all wisdom belongs to marble, he said, sitting beside her. Even the reeds speak if you know how to listen. Rania traced the symbols slowly, aloud, her voice low. She stumbled on several glyphs, paused, then corrected herself. Menkau did not interrupt. When she reached the final line, she set the scroll down. The river remembers even the footsteps of birds, she murmured. Menkau looked at her then, eyes softened by some emotion he did not name. You read like someone who knows what it is to be remembered, he said. She offered no answer. She simply nodded and set the scroll aside. That evening, as she passed the courtyard where the older attendants gathered to spin thread and hum songs of the old dynasties, she caught a phrase from one of the lullabies. He who listens to silence walks with gods. The words struck her not with their sound, but with their stillness, as if she had been meant to hear them at just that moment. In the moon's next turning, she was summoned again. The note came not in the hand of a servant this time, but as a folded flower, an actual bloom, white and faintly fragrant, left on her mat before dawn. Tucked within its petals was a single ivory bead. She knew, she prepared. That night, the chamber was different once more. The walls had been draped with deep blue linen, and copper lamps had been lit with oil that burned with a soft green hue. The space was warmer than before, yet quieter. There were no scrolls, no trays of fruit, only two cushions facing one another beneath a canopy woven with stars. The Pharaoh stood as she entered, his back straight, his expression unreadable. You've been reading, he said. Yes, my lord. And listening? Always. He gestured for her to sit, then took his place across from her. For a time, they remained in silence. He watched her, but not with the distance of royalty. There was a kind of searching in his gaze, not for answers, but for depth. He reached for a small vessel and poured in both a dark infusion that smelled of hibiscus and anise. When she took the cup, their hands did not meet, but the space between them felt changed, no longer ceremonial, but known. I once believed that only the bold earned a place near the throne, he said. But boldness is loud. It fills the room with itself. It leaves no room to listen. Rania took a sip, the warmth curling in her throat. And now? Now I find myself waiting for silence to teach me. He leaned back slightly, letting the shadows of the canopy play across his face. There are many in this palace who know how to speak, he said, but few who know how to remain. You do not try to hold the moment, you let it unfold. She placed her cup gently on the mat and looked at him. I was taught that nothing held too tightly survives the summer heat, she said softly. A flicker of amusement crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the early shape of admiration. Not the desire for a face or a form, but for the interior space that rarely reveals itself. You have not asked me what I want of you, he said. I will know when I'm meant to. His gaze held hers longer now. And if I want nothing, then I will still serve. He fell silent again, and in that hush something shifted in the air. Not power, not submission, but recognition, the kind that moves between two people when no roles are required. He rose slowly and crossed to a small table she had not noticed before. Upon it lay a simple object, a reed flute carved with the symbol of Ma'at, the goddess of balance. "This was mine when I was a boy," he said, "before I was Pharaoh." He held it out to her, not to keep, but to touch. She reached for it, fingers brushing its smooth, time-worn surface. It was warm, not from the room, but from the memory it carried. "Play," he said. "I do not know how. Then let the silence play through you." She lifted it to her lips, unsure, and let out the gentlest breath. A soft, broken tone emerged. Not music, not yet, but not noise either. She tried again. The sound was clearer, fragile like new silk. The Pharaoh listened with his eyes closed. When she stopped, he opened them again. "You have known the shape of silence," he said. "Now you will learn its song." He took the flute from her hands and set it back upon the table. Then, without ceremony or gesture, he turned and departed, leaving her once more with the echo of words not spoken. She sat beneath the canopy long after he had gone, her fingers curled slightly as though the reed still rested there. And in her chest, something very old and very new began to stir. Not desire, not ambition, but understanding. She had been given a space to fill, and she would fill it with quiet, with presence, with the music of stillness. The days that followed settled around Rania like folds of linen, light and layered. She moved through the palace with the grace of one who no longer questioned her place within it. Her duties resumed, arranging bowls of fruit, tending to the oils in the hall of fragrance, assisting the older women with their writing palettes. But each movement now carried a weightless intention, as if her limbs had begun to understand the rhythm of something deeper than routine. Tia, ever watchful, said little. Their friendship had never relied on many words, and now in the hush that surrounded Rania, their bond seemed to soften further, like cloth worn smooth by years of quiet use. They shared glances, moments in passing, pieces of fruit taken together in the shade of the courtyard trees. Tia never asked what had changed. Rania never explained. The lessons with Menkau grew more complex. One afternoon, he handed her a tablet marked with verses from the ancient prayers, words once spoken only by temple priests in the dark of the lunar rituals. Rania traced them slowly, the reed pen in her hand more familiar now, her strokes more certain. Menkau watched her with narrowed eyes. "You read now like someone who sees beyond the meaning," he said. "What do you find in these words?" Rania hesitated, then spoke. "Stillness, but not empty, awaiting." Menkau grunted approvingly. "Then you are reading as the gods do." They studied longer that day, and when the oil lamp burned low, he placed a small slip of parchment before her. "This," he said, "is not for the temple. It is a poem from an old court scribe, long dead." Rania read it in silence. The words were delicate yet steady. They spoke of waiting at a window, of watching the shadows of birds move across the wall, of recognizing love not in touch, but in the absence of it. When she finished, she folded the parchment carefully. "Who was it for?" she asked. "No one remembers," Menkau replied. "But that is the nature of quiet love. It does not demand to be remembered. It simply shapes the one who carries it." That night, she did not dream of the river, but of wind. It passed through the halls of the palace like a question, stirring the curtains, shifting the lanterns, breathing over her skin as if searching. She awoke just before dawn, the sense of movement still lingering on her arms. She rose and bathed, not because it was required, but because it steadied her. She poured rose water over her shoulders, tied her hair into a loose coil, and sat by the lattice window as the sun slowly climbed into the pale sky. She watched the birds rise from the trees, their wings flashing white in the morning light. A folded cloth lay beside her mat, plain, unmarked, but familiar in shape. Inside, a single phrase, "The garden at twilight, come without words." When the hour came, she walked alone. The garden was quiet, the sky painted in soft orange and violet, the scent of night-blooming jasmine beginning to rise. Lanterns had not yet been lit, and the last light of day made the stone path glow faintly under her feet. He stood near the reflecting pool, not dressed in royal color, not marked by crown or insignia. Just a man in linen, his sleeves rolled, His arms crossed as he looked down into the water. She approached without sound, stopping a few paces away. He did not look up. "What do you see in the water?" he asked. Rania followed his gaze. The pool reflected not just the sky, but the dark leaves above, the slow ripple of a single fish, the faint glint of starlight beginning to form. "Movement," she said quietly. "That does not disturb the surface." He turned to her then, slowly, as if he too had been moving through thought instead of time. "I once believed stillness was the absence of all things," he said, "but it is not." "No," Rania said, "it is what remains when all else has passed." He smiled, faint, almost reluctant. "There are courtiers who clamor for place, daughters of lords trained from birth in the language of flattery. They speak to be heard. And you wish to hear," she said. He nodded, his eyes catching the last light of the sun. "Would you stay silent?" he asked, "even if I offered you a voice?" "I would use it only when it deepened the silence." The breeze moved through the garden just then, rustling the papyrus stalks, brushing against their skin with the softness of breath. He stepped closer, but not enough to breach the space she held. "There is a chamber," he said, "not far from here. It was once used by my mother for her readings, when she was still queen in name, if not in power." "There, I have heard of her," Rania said. "She was called the Quiet Flame." "She burned steadily," he said, "but never rose too high. She taught me that presence is not proven by how loud a voice is, but by how long it echoes when silence returns." He reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a small object wrapped in linen. He placed it gently in her hands. Inside was a ring, carved not of gold, but of smooth ivory, etched with the symbol of the lotus in bloom. "It is not for show," he said. "It is for remembering, not of me, but of what this moment is." She looked at the ring, then at him. "Then I will wear it only when I need to remember the sound of stillness," he nodded. They did not embrace, did not speak further. As the lanterns were finally lit in the outer court, casting flickers against the stone walls, Rania turned and left the garden, the ring cradled in her palm. And as she walked the quiet corridors back to the House of Flowers, she thought not of her place in the palace, nor of the path ahead, only of the water, of the way it reflected light without breaking, and of the silence they had shared without ever needing to fill it. The days slipped past like beads along a silken thread, each one gentle in its unfolding, each one shaped by the hush that lingered in the air between duties, between glances, between the quiet movement of the sun across the sky. In the House of Flowers, Rania's presence began to settle into something unspoken but known. The older attendants nodded at her with a subtle respect. The younger girls moved aside in the corridors without hesitation. No titles had been given. No changes had been named. But something had shifted. She still tended to her daily tasks, mixing oils, binding herbs, refreshing the carved stone basins with petals and water. But she did so with a calm that needed no witness. And when she returned to her chamber at the end of the day, she would sit with the lamp unlit, letting the dark wrap itself around her like a shawl, the ivory ring resting in her palm. She wore it now on a cord around her neck, tucked beneath her tunic where no eyes could see. It was not a token of favor, not a promise, but a thread connecting her to something deeper than recognition. It reminded her not of who had given it, but of what she had carried into that garden, that silence, that stillness, that clear and present listening. Tia noticed, of course. They sat beneath the sycamore in the far courtyard one late morning, shelling pods for the midday meal, their fingers stained faintly green. Tia glanced at her from the corner of her eye. "You're further away than before," she said. "I am still here." "Yes, but not entirely." Rania smiled but said nothing. She broke open a pod with care, dropping the beans into a clay bowl. "I don't ask," Tia continued, "because I know not all things are meant to be spoken, but stillness is its own language, and yours has changed." Rania's hands paused for a breath. Then softly she said, "Sometimes we grow quiet not because we have less to say, but because we have found something that doesn't need words." Tia didn't answer right away. When she did, it was with a smile that curved gently, without envy, without longing. "I hope what you found is worth the silence it asks." That afternoon, another lesson with Menkau awaited. He was less severe than usual, his scrolls scattered more loosely, his voice more thoughtful than commanding. "Tell me," he said as she knelt beside the low table, What does it mean to be remembered? Rania tilted her head. By whom? By no one, and by everyone. She thought for a moment. It means to leave a mark that lingers after the echo fades. And how does one make such a mark? By not seeking it. Menkau leaned back, his arms crossed loosely, watching her with something between curiosity and pride. You have begun to understand what many do not, he said. That legacy is not in stone or gold, but in the shape of presence, in the way silence deepens after a person has left the room. He handed her a scroll then, not of poetry or prayer, but of lineage. Names written in fine ink, generations of royal blood, titles and alliances. Why this, she asked. Because you must know what you do not belong to, he said, before you can understand what you are becoming. That evening, as the air turned cool and the lamps began to glow along the palace walls, Rania sat in the garden near the fish pond. The night was quiet, the sky low and heavy with stars. No summons came, no message. And yet, she waited, not for him, not for words, but for the feeling she had come to know so well. That space where the world pauses, where the noise slips away, and something deeper rises to meet the breath. She traced the edge of the ivory ring beneath her tunic. She listened. A breeze moved through the papyrus stalks. Footsteps followed. She did not look up immediately. She simply shifted her breath, made space. He sat beside her, not close, not distant, just enough to share the scent of the water, the hush of evening. I watched my father once, he said. From behind a lattice wall, he thought he was alone. He stood beside this same pond, speaking to no one. And in that moment, I saw more of him than I had in all his public days. Rania said nothing. He looked down at the water, his reflection blurring in the ripples. I wonder now if that is what I've become, most myself in moments no one sees. But seen, she said gently, not by crowds, but by the stillness. He turned to her. Yes, exactly that. They sat for a while, the sky deepening to a shade beyond blue. There are choices ahead, he said, ones I cannot delay much longer. She nodded. I do not ask for certainty, she said, only that whatever path you choose, you carry silence with you, not as a burden, but as a guide. His gaze lingered on her face, then drifted back to the pond. I once thought power was in what one commanded, but now I think it may be in what one protects. They said no more. When he rose, he did so without gesture, leaving behind only the faint warmth where he had been. And Rania, her hands resting gently in her lap, remained long after, the stars thick above her, the garden steeped in that old familiar hush. She was no longer waiting, she was simply being. The rains did not often visit Thebes, but when they did, it was without warning. That morning, a gray veil drifted across the sky, muting the golden brilliance of the palace walls. The scent of dust meeting water rose gently from the stones, and the birds quieted, as though listening for something older than thunder. In the house of flowers, the atmosphere turned inward. The courtyards emptied. The girls stayed within, tending to their stitching and their jars of balm, voices softened by the rhythm of falling rain. Outside, the gardens blurred into mist. The sycamores leaned under the weight of their dripping leaves, and rivulets began to trace the paths between flagstones. Rania welcomed the stillness. It was not the silence of ceremony or obedience, but the rare hush that came when nature herself pressed pause. She sat on the edge of her sleeping mat, a scroll open before her, its surface lit by the dull glow of a single lamp. It was an old piece, a hymn to the river god Hapi, hand-copied in Menkau's spidery script. The words were poetic and cyclical, like the river's own turning. You are the one who feeds all mouths, who waters the meadows when the sky turns dry, who walks unseen and yet holds the world. Her lips moved over the lines without sound, tasting the weight of them, the way they lingered in the mouth like honey stirred into tea. She did not need to be told their meaning. She felt them in her bones. That afternoon, as the rain lightened to a mist, Menkau summoned her, not to the usual chamber, but to a small alcove in the western wing, where statues of past scribes lined the walls like silent judges. The floor was uneven here, worn by centuries of quiet footsteps. He stood near a basin filled with black ink, several tablets laid before him. Today you will write, he said. Not copy, create. Rania blinked. Create what? A thought that does not belong to the gods, a thought that belongs to you. He handed her a reed pen. She dipped it, hesitated, then touched it to the tablet. She began slowly, not with a declaration, but with a question. What is a name if no one speaks it? She paused. The ink shimmered faintly in the low light. Then she continued. What is presence if it leaves no shadow? Line by line her thoughts flowed, not grand, not rehearsed, but real. She wrote of watching the garden at night, of silence that teaches, of words left unspoken and yet understood. When she finished, Menkau lifted the tablet, read it once, then nodded without praise. Let this be the first of many. He placed it carefully among the other writings, not marked by title or author, but set with quiet reverence. As she left the alcove, Rania felt no triumph, only a deeper stillness. That night, the air remained thick with rain's memory. She lit no lamp. The window remained open, and the distant drip of water lulled the house of flowers into a kind of sacred sleep. In the hours before dawn, another message arrived, this time pressed into soft clay, its symbol unmistakable. The eye of Horus carved beneath a crescent moon. She understood. When the time came, she followed the path without escort. No guards waited, no servants, only the open archway leading to the queen's former chamber, the one he had spoken of weeks before. Inside, the space had changed. Gone were the symbols of rule. In their place stood shelves of scrolls, cushions shaped for rest, and tall braziers filled with quiet flame. The scent of cedar and wild mint drifted in spirals. He was there, seated beside a low table, a tablet in his hand. You wrote of shadows, he said without greeting. Why? Because we exist even when no one watches. He looked up, studying her. And that is enough? For some, she replied. For those who have learned to live within. He gestured for her to sit. Tonight there was no tension, no question of intention. They sat across from one another as one might sit beside still water, aware of the depths but not reaching for them. The silence was not absence, it was fullness. He poured tea, earthy, laced with fennel and lime blossom. She accepted it with a small nod. I am often asked, he said, why I come here to this quiet room when the throne room waits. Rania didn't answer. They think I come here for peace, he continued, but it is not peace I find. It is clarity, the absence of performance. He looked at her, long and level. You do not perform. I do not know how. You could learn, he said. Easily. You have the posture, the eyes, the restraint. She shook her head. But if I did, she said, you would stop asking me to return. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. You are more dangerous than a vizier, he said. She did not smile in return, but her gaze held steady. You are more alone than a king should be. He fell silent then, not in discomfort, but in consideration. No one had said that to him. Perhaps no one had dared, but she had not meant it as a rebuke, only a truth. When she rose to leave, he did not stop her, but as she stepped into the threshold, he said without turning, Rania, yes, my lord. When I speak again to the priests about the succession, I will not begin with names. She paused. But with presence, he finished. Then she left, the chamber quiet behind her, the sound of her footsteps soft against the stone. She returned to her quarters before the morning bell, her robe with mist, her skin carrying the scent of cedar and candle smoke. And in the palm of her hand, she still felt the memory of the clay tablet, cool and solid, marked by her own hand, not for glory, not for record, but for truth. The sun returned to Thebes with quiet confidence, its light unfiltered by cloud or mist. It spread over the palace like a silken sheet, warming the limestone walls and coaxing the fragrance from every bloom in the house of flowers. The rains were gone, but their memory lingered in the scent of damp earth and the softness of the air. Rania moved through the garden paths with the same measured grace she had always carried, but her senses were tuned differently now. Each step felt more deliberate, each breeze more revealing. The palace no longer held the same air of mystery. It still whispered, yes, but its language was one she now understood, not just with her ears, but with the silence she had cultivated deep within. The other girls had begun to notice her absence. Though no one said it outright, a space had formed around her, not of distance, but of reverence. Where once they may have whispered after she passed, now they simply moved aside, not from fear, but with the calm awareness of something unfolding that did not belong to them. Only Tia remained as she had always been, present, steady, unintrusive. That morning, as they arranged garlands for the statue of Hathor in the small eastern shrine, Tia paused, her hands stilling over the woven stems. I used to wonder what silence sounded like to you, she said. Rania looked up. And now? Tia smiled faintly. Now I think it sounds like knowing your place without needing to keep it. They said nothing more, but the garlands in their hands seemed suddenly lighter, the petals brighter under the morning sun. Later that day, Menkau sent for her again. This time he waited not in the study or alcove, but in the old scribe's garden, where cypress trees cast long shadows over the gravel paths, and the scent of papyrus hung in the air. He sat cross-legged by a shallow pool, tossing breadcrumbs to the fish that lingered near the surface. "Do you know what these fish are called?" he asked as she approached. Rania shook her head. "They're called silent eaters. They never disturb the water, even when they feed. Their presence is marked only by the ripples they leave behind." She sat beside him without speaking. "I've read your writing again," he said, drawing a folded tablet from beneath his robe. "It's not poetry. It's not prayer, but it breathes. That is rarer than people think." He handed her the tablet. Rania unfolded it slowly. It was her own, but now a symbol had been added, small and subtle in the corner, the emblem of the Royal Archive. "I was told to submit it," Menkau said, "not by decree, but by suggestion." Rania touched the edge of the symbol with her fingertip. "It will be read?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "and not just by those who seek beauty, but by those who seek meaning." He stood then, brushing his hands clean. "Prepare yourself," he said. "You are being shaped not just for presence, but for permanence." When he left, the garden fell into stillness once more. The fish continued their slow, soundless movements. Rania remained seated by the pool, her eyes on the place where the ripples faded into nothing. That night there was no message, no invitation. But still she waited, not in the outer garden, nor in her chamber, but by the columns of the Queen's former library. The doors remained closed, the torches unlit, but she knew, without needing to see, that he was near, that he too had begun to understand the value of letting time pass between presence and return. When dawn came, she returned to her quarters with a calm heart. She had not been summoned, but she had not been forgotten. In the days that followed, the palace stirred with preparations, not for a feast nor a war, but something less visible. Meetings whispered behind half-open doors. A chambermaid spoke of scrolls being unrolled late into the night. The scent of fresh ink lingered in the corridors long after the scribes had gone. Citra, ever composed, came to Rania one morning with her hands folded tightly. "You will be called soon," she said. "Not by him, but by those who question him." Rania met her gaze. "I am ready." Citra looked at her for a long moment. "Few ever are," she said. "But readiness is not in the words one speaks. It is in the silence one does not break." She turned, then paused at the threshold. "They will try to unsettle you. They will speak to measure your stillness. Let them." Rania bowed her head. And so, when the day came, she walked with her spine long and her breath steady through the corridors that led not to gardens or private chambers, but to the stone room of the scribes, where advisors, elders, and recorders gathered not for gossip, but for deliberation. She was led inside without announcement. The room was bright with oil lamps, their flames held in mirrored bronze bowls. Long scrolls lay across the central table. Men sat with styluses in hand. No one greeted her. She was told to sit on a simple mat near the center. A man with a blue sash, the elder archivist, lifted a parchment. "You wrote this," he said. "Yes." "You understand that what you write now lives beyond you?" "Yes." "Then answer this," he said. "Why do you believe presence should matter more than birthright?" Rania inhaled slowly. "Because birth gives beginning," she said, "but presence gives shape." A murmur ran through the room. Another man leaned forward, older, his eyes pale with years. "And what shape do you claim to give?" "None," she said. "I am not the potter. I am the clay. But even clay remembers the hands that touched it." A pause. Then parchment shifted. Styluses scratched. Another question. "And if the hand that touches you is that of the Pharaoh, do you shape him, or does he shape you?" She let the silence rise, let it stretch long and full. "Neither," she said. "We shape the silence between us." The room fell utterly still, and somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the river turned slowly in its bed, unnoticed but steady, carrying its secrets toward the sea. The night that followed the inquiry in the stone room was heavy with stillness, as though the palace itself held its breath. Rania returned to the House of Flowers, not in triumph nor defeat, but in a deeper quiet than she had ever known. No one spoke as she passed. The other girls did not look away. nor did they look directly. It was not fear. It was reverence for what they did not yet understand, but felt pressing gently through the air like the first cool wind before the floodwaters rise. In her chamber, the oil lamp remained unlit. She sat near the window, tracing the curve of the ivory ring at her throat with one thumb, her thoughts not dwelling on the questions she had been asked, nor on the men who had asked them. Instead, she thought of the silence that had followed her words. Not emptiness, but acknowledgement. She did not know what would come next, and she did not need to. The following morning, the sky broke into a brilliant gold. The rains had cleansed the land, and now the sun moved freely, igniting the tops of the walls, the tips of the palms, the edges of every petal in the house of flowers. The world shimmered, and with it came a renewed rhythm to the day. The girls returned to their duties, voices soft but steadier than before. Life continued. Rania, too, resumed her tasks. She ground herbs for the healer's salves, readied the incense mixtures for the afternoon rituals, and rearranged the woven mats in the meditation hall. But wherever she moved, a hush seemed to follow, not imposed, but invited. Later that day, she was summoned, not to the queen's chamber, not to the garden, but to the temple gate within the inner palace grounds. It was a place few of the House of Flowers ever entered, its path lined with sycamores and pale blue lotus blossoms that bloomed only at twilight. Citra walked beside her. "They have seen enough," she said quietly as they passed the garden walls. "Now they wish to see what you choose when no one watches." Rania nodded. "And what if I choose nothing? Then they will learn that even nothing, when chosen in stillness, holds meaning." At the temple gate, Citra stopped and placed a hand on Rania's shoulder. "Inside, you will be alone. It is not a test, though they may tell you it is. It is only a space. You decide what to fill it with." Rania stepped forward and entered. The air inside was cool and dense with the scent of sacred oils. The walls were adorned not with depictions of gods, but of ordinary scenes. Women grinding grain, children playing, water poured from clay jars into eager hands. The floor was polished stone, the ceiling high and dark. A single beam of light cut through the gloom from an opening above, illuminating a square in the center of the room. There was no altar, no audience, just the space. She walked to the light and stood there, not waiting, not performing, simply being. And slowly, memory came. Not of palaces nor scrolls, nor quiet glances shared in the moonlight, but of her mother's hands, dark with work, fragrant with herbs, tying a ribbon into her braid as the sun rose over the riverbank. Of her brother laughing in the dust, chasing birds through the reeds. Of her father sitting silently by the fire, mending nets, nodding once at her across the flickering glow. Of the sycamore tree where she had once lain, eyes closed, breath slow, the world around her moving in soft circles. She knelt, not in prayer, but in return. She touched the floor with both palms. It was cool, solid, familiar. The stone did not ask her to speak. It asked only that she remember. And so she stayed. For how long, she did not know. Long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the quiet to deepen. When she rose, she said no words. She simply bowed once to the space itself and turned. Outside, Citra waited, eyes unreadable. "You did not kneel to the gods," she said. "No," Rania replied. Citra studied her face for a long moment. "Good," she said softly. "They do not need kneeling. They need remembering." That evening, as the last light curled over the palace roofs, the summons came, not in clay, nor ink, nor folded cloth. A figure appeared in the courtyard. Not a messenger. Him. He walked without guard, without fanfare, dressed simply, his head uncovered. The girls who saw him moved quickly aside. Even Tia, ever steady, stepped back with wide eyes. No one spoke. He found Rania by the fountain, her hands submerged in water, watching the light catch the ripples. She looked up as he approached, her gaze steady, calm. "I walked here," he said. "I wanted to come not as Pharaoh, but as a man who has made a decision." She dried her hands on her robe, then waited. "I no longer wish to ask if you will stay," he said. "I wish to ask if you will stand beside me, not in ceremony, but in silence, in presence." She stepped forward, slowly, and met his eyes. "I have stood here," she said, "long before you came." He reached for her hand, but did not take it. "Then let us remain," he said, "not for what they see, but for what we are when no one is watching." She nodded once, and the sound of the water continued to flow, quiet and steady beside them. And around the house of flowers, the wind moved through the jasmine, carrying with it not the scent of power, but of something softer, something truer, something becoming. The days that followed moved with a rhythm unlike any Rania had known before. Not hurried, not ceremonial, but deeply quiet, as though the palace itself had settled into breath beside her. Her duties in the House of Flowers continued, but the shape of them changed. No longer was she one among many. Now she moved between spaces few others entered, delivering scrolls to the archivists, carrying messages sealed with the royal mark, preparing oils not only for ritual, but for thought. And always, always she returned to silence. The other girls treated her differently, but with no trace of resentment. Their glances were gentle, their steps quiet when they passed her. Tia, who had watched it all unfold with eyes steady as river stones, remained by her side when space allowed, offering wordless presence more often than speech. In the cool mornings, Rania walked through the courtyards alone, the sun just beginning to gild the edges of the walls. She passed the pool where lilies slept beneath their leaves, the fig tree whose branches curled like questions, and the marble columns that held centuries of breath between them. She no longer needed to be told where to go. She was no longer summoned. She simply moved, and where she moved, space opened. One morning, as the first call of temple birds stirred the dawn, she found herself at the edge of the eastern garden. It had been many days since she had stood beneath its acacia trees, many more since she had poured wine under the gaze of the man who had seen her first there. She did not seek him, yet somehow he was there. He wore no royal robe, just a plain tunic, his arms bare in the warmth of early sun. His hair was loose, falling in soft waves around his face. He stood by the reflecting pool, not as Pharaoh, not as sovereign, but as someone still seeking the shape of a moment. He turned when she approached. There was no surprise in his face, only recognition. "I was told you might be here," he said. "No one told me," she replied. He smiled faintly. "Then you have learned to arrive without being called." She stood beside him, their reflections drifting in the surface of the pool like thoughts not yet spoken. "I remember when you poured wine beneath that tree," he said, nodding toward the acacia. "You did not look up. You had not spoken to me. And when I did, you still waited. I was listening." He folded his arms, watching the breeze ripple the water. "There is talk in the court," he said, "of changes, of choices I am said to be making." She said nothing. "Some believe I am losing sense," he continued, "that I have been swayed by something too quiet to trust." Now she looked at him. "Do they know what you seek?" "No," he said softly, "nor do they ask." She took a breath, the air cool and sweet with myrrh and earth. "Then let them speak of what they do not understand. Your silence has been your compass before. It can be again." He turned to her, the wind stirring the edge of his tunic. "I wish to name you." Rania's heart did not quicken. It did not need to. The stillness within her held steady. "What name?" she asked. "A companion of the lotus seat. Not concubine, not wife. A presence, a voice beside mine, not louder, not softer. Aligned." She was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "And what does that mean?" "It means no fanfare, no stone inscriptions, but when I walk among them, they will know who stood beside me in the room where no voices were raised." She closed her eyes for a moment, not to decide, but to listen. And when she opened them, the answer was already settled. "Then I will stand," she said. "Not for you, not for the court, but for the space we share." His shoulders eased. He reached for her hand, but again did not touch. "In 2 days' time, the Feast of Hathor begins," he said. "They will expect new offerings, new alliances. They will see what we have chosen. And when they do, they will understand," he said. "Not all at once, but over time." Rania nodded. That evening, in the House of Flowers, the lamps burned longer than usual. Not for celebration, but for preparation. The women dressed in silks perfumed with vetiver and honey. The corridors shimmered with light, but Rania sat in her chamber, combing her hair in silence, her robe the color of riverstone. Tia entered without knocking. She sat beside her on the floor, resting her head against the cool stone wall. "When you stand beside him," she said quietly, "I will be watching." "I know," Rania said. "I will not wave. I wouldn't expect you to. But I will breathe," Tia whispered, "because I will know you are not lost to us. You are only more deeply found." And Rania smiled. The next morning, the sun rose over the Nile, bright and slow, and in the stillness that followed, the palace began to prepare for a feast, for a choice, for a woman who would not arrive with trumpets, but with the hush of a single breath. The day of the Feast of Hathor dawned with a gentleness that seemed to honor the goddess herself. The sun rose slowly over Thebes, its first rays gilding the domes of the temple roofs and brushing the garden leaves with gold. From the river came the faint sound of drums, soft, steady, like the heartbeat of the city, and from within the palace, the scent of incense already curled through the halls. Rania awoke early, though she had not truly slept. The night had passed not in restlessness, but in quiet thought. She had lain with her eyes open, watching the shifting patterns of light on her chamber ceiling, her fingers curled around the ivory ring at her throat. There had been no anxiety, only stillness, a waiting that did not press against her, but sat beside her like an old friend. She rose and bathed in silence, pouring cool water from a clay pitcher into the basin, watching it ripple over her skin like river light. She dressed not in the elaborate silks offered by the attendants, but in a robe of soft linen dyed the color of wet sand. Her hair she wore loose, unbraided, unadorned. There was no need for embellishment. Her presence would speak. When she stepped into the garden, the air was already thick with scent: lotus, crushed myrrh, roasted dates, rose petals soaked in orange oil. Birds rustled in the fig trees, and from the high balconies, the chatter of foreign guests drifted down like dust on sunlight. The palace had transformed, not with loudness, but with density. It breathed celebration in every corner. She was not alone for long. Citra approached, her robe darker than usual, her face calm but sharpened by purpose. "They will be watching," she said simply. Rania inclined her head. "I do not enter for their eyes." Citra allowed herself a brief, unreadable smile. "No, but still they will look." They walked together to the outer hall, where the steps led up to the procession grounds. Already the dignitaries had begun to gather. Nobles draped in layers of embroidered linen, generals in bronze and leather, priests with their shaved heads gleaming beneath tall headdresses. The air shimmered with heat and perfume, and beneath it all lay the ever-present thrum of anticipation. When the Pharaoh appeared, the murmurs rose like a wave. He wore no crown. Instead, a simple circlet of white gold rested on his brow, and his tunic was plain but perfect, his feet bare upon the stone. He walked with neither haste nor grandeur, just presence. Rania stood at the edge of the steps, still and quiet. She did not descend to meet him. She did not move. And then, neither did he. He turned, in full view of court and country, and extended his hand, not in command, not in possession, but in invitation. She stepped forward, and in the heat of the day, with all eyes upon them, she took his hand. It was warm, grounded, real. The silence that fell was not empty. It was reverent. It was weight. Together they walked into the temple grounds where the Feast of Hathor would begin, not as king and consort, nor as ruler and subject, but as two who had chosen each other in the space between breath and word. Inside the temple, drums began to beat, slow, rhythmic, ancient. They walked past the statues, past the offerings of sweet beer and pomegranate, past the rows of lotus-filled basins. At the altar, he stopped and placed a single bloom, white, unopened, into the sacred bowl. Then he turned to her. She took the bloom and with steady fingers opened its petals gently in her palm. The priests watched. The elders watched. The scribes leaned forward, pens stilled mid-stroke. No vow was spoken, no title proclaimed. But in the softness of her touch, in the shared weight of the silence, a new shape formed, one that could not be written in stone. That evening, the celebration filled the city. Torches lit the courtyards, music flowed from balconies, dancers moved through the streets in slow, spiraling patterns. The scent of honey bread and roasted lamb drifted from every household, and laughter spilled across rooftops. But Rania did not stay in the public eye. She returned to the garden where she had first heard her name spoken by a stranger beneath the acacia tree. She sat beneath its branches, now heavy with bloom, and watched the stars rise. He found her there, sometime after the second hour. He said nothing as he sat beside her. They did not speak of the day. They did not speak of the court. They did not speak of anything that might fade with time. Instead, they sat in the hush between moments and breathed. At last, he turned to her and said, "They will try to name what we have done. And they will fail, she said. Yes, he nodded. And that is why it will last. She reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to feel its warmth, its weight. And in the darkness, with the stars above and the earth cool beneath them, they rested in the silence they had made together, a silence strong enough to carry them forward. The days after the Feast of Hathor passed like water over polished stone, unhurried, gleaming, quiet. In the palace, routines resumed, though now touched by a subtle change. The music in the garden seemed slower, more contemplative. The conversations in the stone courtyards drifted like smoke, less pointed, more curious. Whispers came and went, but none could name what had shifted. They could only sense that something had. Rania returned to her quiet places, not out of avoidance, but out of instinct. She spent long hours in the scribe's garden, feeding the silent fish, her reed pen tracing slow, deliberate words into clay. Menkau continued her instruction, though now their conversations had grown more philosophical, drifting into questions that had no correct answer. He did not ask her about the feast. He did not need to. One morning, as she entered the alcove near the Queen's old library, she found a new scroll laid out for her. Its parchment was thicker, the ink richer, its header marked by a seal she did not immediately recognize, an open palm wrapped in a wreath of papyrus. Beneath it, a single line. This is the beginning of the record of the one who stood beside silence. She understood. It was not a proclamation. It was not a title. It was the beginning of a presence. For the first time, Rania was asked to write not only for herself, not only in the quiet corners of the scholar's garden, but for the archive that lived beyond breath, beyond court, beyond reign, beyond name. She was to document, in her own way, the moments between ceremony, the shape of the unseen, the feeling of a pause before a choice. And so each afternoon she wrote. Not every day brought clarity. Some scrolls began with only a word. Others unfolded in long, flowing strokes that surprised even her. She did not record history. She recorded stillness, the kind that passed unnoticed through marble halls, through conversations left unfinished, through the weight of footsteps across polished floors. Meanwhile, he continued to rule. There were meetings, delegations, treaties revised and laws reconsidered, but he returned to her when he could, not always in presence, but often in message. A line etched in clay, a folded flower left in her chamber. Once, a single feather from a heron wrapped in linen with the word balance inked beside it. They did not speak of love. There was no need. The bond between them did not live in passion or in poetry. It lived in the shared breath before sunrise, in the echo of shared silences, in the way she stood behind him during moments of doubt, not visible, not distant, but present. And the court began to understand, slowly. They no longer asked who she was. They asked instead what she meant. Some referred to her as the silent scribe, others as the breath before judgment. But none used her name without care. It was not feared, but revered, as one might revere a still body of water on which no wind dares stir. One afternoon, as the season began to turn and the heat softened into evening breeze, she returned to the reflecting pool. There she found Tia. Her friend knelt by the edge, arranging reeds into small floating bundles, their tips set alight in quiet tribute to the goddess Neith. Rania joined her without speaking. Together, they lit 5 bundles, watching them drift into the center of the water where the breeze carried them in lazy spirals. Tia finally broke the quiet. When we first arrived, I thought I would become a singer. Rania smiled softly. You would have been. Tia shook her head. No, I sang for attention, not for reverence. The flames on the water danced like tiny stars. I no longer wish to be heard, Tia said. I wish to remain near what is worth listening to. Rania reached for her hand. For a moment, their fingers rested lightly together, the way water meets water. Later that evening, as the stars returned to their places in the sky, she was summoned, not by servant or scroll, but by a soft knock at the lattice door of her chamber. He stood there, robe loose, eyes tired but bright. Walk with me, he said. They moved through the gardens, not as king and consort, but as 2 souls walking alongside their own breath. The jasmine was beginning to bloom again. The paths were lit by low lanterns that flickered with the rhythm of thought. He did not speak until they reached the eastern gate, where the city could be seen in shadowed distance. I've begun to wonder, he said, how much longer I can rule this way. Quietly. You mean without display? Yes, without thunder, without spectacle. They listen, but their patience wears thin. And yours. I can wait longer, he said, but not alone. She looked out over the rooftops, the oil lamps and windows blinking like scattered stars. Then let them think your stillness is weakness, she said, so long as you know it is not. He turned to her, and in his eyes there was both fatigue and gratitude. And you? I will remain, she said, not as echo, but as stillness itself. He nodded once, and they stood at the edge of the world, with all of Thebes breathing beneath them. In the dark, neither moved, and overhead the stars bore witness, not to power, but to presence. The following weeks passed as gently as the Nile in the season of retreat. The floodwaters had drawn back, leaving behind rich, dark soil that would birth the next season's grain. And so, too, within the palace, something quiet and fertile settled. The storm of curiosity surrounding Ranya's presence had begun to soften. The questioning eyes, once sharp and calculating, now regarded her with a kind of cautious acceptance, as though realizing that she would not be moved by whispers or disarmed by ceremony. She remained where she had always been, among the spaces between moments. Her days continued in silence and observation. She met with Menkau to study the older texts, scrolls once read only by temple scribes, containing the teachings of past rulers, ancient reflections on justice and time. Some were crumbling, their fibers worn thin by centuries of touch. She handled them with reverence, brushing each line with her eyes before letting her hands follow. You carry the past like someone born to it, Menkau once told her. She had replied only, I carry what listens back. At dusk, she often walked through the Hall of Columns, where tall stone shafts rose like reeds turned to rock, their tops vanishing into shadow. She no longer paused to admire their size. She moved among them as one who understood their purpose, not to impress, but to hold space, to give shape to the air around them. One evening, as she returned from the scribe's garden, she found a folded cloth on her mat, not silk, not adorned, just plain linen, soft with age. Inside it, a single strip of papyrus, and on it only 2 words, the chamber. She needed no explanation. She dressed in quiet haste and crossed the palace alone. The corridors were dim, but the path was familiar. The scent of cedar and oil hung low in the air, and the doors to the queen's former chamber stood slightly ajar. Inside, he waited. He stood near the central brazier, the fire casting a warm glow over his features. He wore a simple robe, unadorned, and in his hands he held a scroll, new, freshly inked. When she entered, he turned to her. I have read your reflections, he said. She said nothing. I asked Menkau to show them to me. She nodded. They are not records, he continued. They are memories made from silence. He held the scroll up. This one, he said, was written the night after the feast. Ranya stepped closer. I remember. You wrote, there is a moment before a hand is taken when the world holds its breath. That is where truth lives, not in the grasp, but in the waiting. He lowered the scroll. That line has stayed with me. She met his gaze. Because it names something that cannot be ruled. Yes, he said softly, and because it reminds me I am not only a king. They stood there, the silence between them filled not with distance, but with the steady pull of understanding. I have made a decision, he said. Ranya did not flinch. The council has pressed me for clarity, he continued, about succession, about legacy. They want names carved, titles given. And will you? I will give them something, he said, but not what they expect. He crossed the chamber to the writing table, lifted a fresh scroll, and unrolled it slowly. It will say only this, may those who follow remember the strength of the unheard. He looked at her. Your words have already shaped this reign, and they will shape what follows, not through decree, but through presence. Ranya's eyes remained on the flame. And what of the world beyond this chamber? She asked. He smiled faintly. It will resist, but even stone yields to time. She stepped forward then, not out of desire, nor duty, but because the space between them had grown smaller than breath. He reached for her hand. This time their fingers met, not with fire, with steadiness, with belonging. He drew her hand to his chest and held it there, over the beat that kept him human beneath the crown. And then, without asking, without announcing, he knelt, not in submission, but in stillness. She stood over him, not as ruler, not as woman chosen, but as the one who had remained, even when the world had turned its face. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind stirred the palms. And in that moment, with no audience, no witness but the walls themselves, something passed between them that no throne could contain. He rose. She stepped back, and both understood that what they had created together could not be undone, only carried forward. That night she returned to her chamber in silence, but in her heart the words began to shape themselves. I did not enter to be seen. I entered because silence had made room, and now she would remain. The season turned once more, and with it, the colors of Thebes shifted subtly. The brightness of summer faded into the rich, ochre tones of late harvest. The river slowed. The scent of pomegranate hung heavier in the air. In the courtyards, the fig trees dropped their last fruit, and the petals of the lotus began to curl inward, not in death, but in rest. Within the palace, change moved more slowly, but no less surely. Rania found herself now not just among scrolls and gardens, but at the edges of council gatherings. She did not speak, she did not sit, but she stood at the threshold of chambers where men with titles and years behind their names debated policy, taxes, roads, and temples. They did not always acknowledge her presence, but their voices softened when she entered. Their hands paused in gesture. Their tones shifted slightly, as if reminded of a quieter kind of power. She took no notes, asked no questions. She listened, and afterward, she walked the palace grounds alone, digesting what she had absorbed. Not the words, but the undercurrents, the silences that had followed certain names, the tension in unfinished phrases, the weight of what had not been said. One evening, as the sun poured its final light into the eastern wing, the Pharaoh found her beneath the pergola of the water garden. She was seated on a low stone bench, a clay tablet resting on her lap, half filled with thoughts, yet unshaped. He approached without ceremony. He had long ceased to arrive with intention. Now he simply arrived. They believe I intend to name a child, he said, standing over her shoulder. She looked up, the sunset behind him casting a golden edge along his jaw. Do you? He sat beside her, his breath slow. I believe a name cannot carry what is not present. She waited. They ask who will rule after me. I ask what should be ruled. He turned to her, his gaze thoughtful. You've made me question what I once accepted without pause. Not by argument, but by remaining. Rania returned her eyes to the tablet. I have given you nothing, she said quietly. No, he answered. You've reminded me of everything I forgot to carry. They sat for a while in that descending light, the scent of jasmine growing stronger as night approached. Eventually, he placed something on the bench between them, a medallion carved of lapis lazuli and copper, shaped into a closed eye, symbol of silent vision. It's not for ceremony, he said. It's not to be worn in public. It's simply to be kept. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was warm, as if it had already been part of her hand before she had touched it. Later, in the house of flowers, the girls gathered near the hearth, weaving wreaths of reeds and dried leaves for the mid-season offering. Tia sat across from Rania, her fingers nimble, her eyes steady. They say you've begun to walk with the advisors, she murmured. I do not walk with them, Rania replied. I walk near them. And do they know how close you are to the throne? Rania tied off the base of her wreath and set it aside. I don't think they understand how far the throne truly is from where I stand. Tia smiled, the corners of her eyes creasing. Perhaps, but they understand something now. And what is that? That you are not rising to power, she said. Power is rising to meet you. The fire crackled gently, and a breeze passed through the lattice windows, fluttering the edge of Rania's robe. That night she returned to the queen's chamber, not by summons, not by invitation. She simply walked the path that had become her own. He was already there, seated near the shelves, a scroll open on his lap. I've begun writing again, he said, glancing up. Rania knelt beside him, not to read, but to be present. He continued, not decrees, not records, just thoughts. Things I cannot speak to the court, ideas I cannot shape aloud. He looked at her. You taught me that silence is not absence, it is space. And now I use it as a room where my mind can walk. She reached for one of the smaller scrolls on the table and unrolled it. The handwriting was rougher than his usual hand, less composed, more human. She read a few lines in silence. I am not afraid of ending. I am afraid of forgetting how to begin again. She looked at him. It is not the end that should trouble you, she said. It is the temptation to stay in the place where you were last heard. He nodded slowly. They did not speak more that evening. The scrolls remained spread between them like fallen leaves, and the flame in the oil lamp burned low and steady. When she left, he did not follow, and when she returned to her chamber, she placed the lapis medallion beside her reed pen, wrapped them both in the cloth her mother had given her long ago, and tied it closed, not to put it away, but to keep it still. For the first time, she slept not as someone waiting for the next summons, but as someone who had already arrived. The river began to recede further, and with it came a hush that blanketed the city like a breath held in devotion. The season of gathering was over. Now came the quiet between harvest and planting, a time for reflection, for offerings, for the slow weaving of what would come next. Within the palace, routine softened. The morning drums grew quieter. Meals became simpler. The light in the corridors grew longer and more golden, like honey drawn slowly from the comb. Rania walked the halls with the calm of one who belonged not just to the space, but to the silence it kept. Her scrolls now lined a narrow shelf in the queen's former chamber, organized by no visible logic but the rhythm in which they had been written, each marked only by a small seal pressed into the corner, the symbol of the closed eye. She continued to write not on command, but when the moment compelled her. She wrote of a courtier's hesitation at the edge of a decision, of the way a pause before speaking could shift a room, of the sacredness of breath before a name was spoken. The Pharaoh read them in the evenings. Sometimes he shared them with Menkau, sometimes with the younger scribes. But most often he read them alone, turning the scrolls slowly in his hands as if they contained not just words, but the weight of unseen things. One morning, before the first bell of the Sun Temple, a messenger arrived at the House of Flowers. He brought no scroll, only a gesture, a hand raised to the heart, then extended toward the eastern gate. Rania followed. The air was crisp, scented with mint and drying reed. The shadows on the palace walls were long and blue. He waited in the inner sanctuary garden, where the pomegranate trees stood bare and the grass had turned pale with season's end. He sat on the edge of a low stone platform, his sandals off, his feet in the cool earth. She approached quietly, then sat beside him. "They have begun to ask again," he said after a long silence. "About legacy?" He nodded. "About heirs? About continuity?" She said nothing. "They believe I'm being irresponsible," he said. "They say it is not enough to be remembered for peace or reform. A lineage must carry the shape forward." Rania reached for a pebble near the edge of the path and rolled it in her fingers. "And what did you tell them?" "That I am not ready to give them what they expect." He looked at her, his eyes heavy but clear. "I do not wish to place a child into a future shaped only by duty, nor do I wish to tie your name to mine by decree." Rania let the pebble drop gently into the soil. "Then don't," she said. "But you would stand with me?" "I already do." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, gazing into the pale grass. "What if I leave no name behind?" She turned to him. "Then let the silence that follows you be the clearest sound." He reached for her hand and placed something in her palm. It was a piece of carved bone, small and smooth, shaped like a bird in flight. "I found this in my mother's private chest," he said. "It was hers from when she was still a girl. She kept it close until the day she died." Rania studied it, the way its edges had been worn by time and touch. "It is not mine to keep," he said, "but I want you to hold it until the day you no longer need to." She closed her fingers around it. "I will." That evening, she walked alone through the scribe's corridor, past the colonnades and the garden walls, past the places where her own presence had once felt uncertain. The servants did not look away. The guards did not stiffen. She passed like water through reeds, unquestioned, unchallenged. In the hall of offerings, she placed the carved bird upon the altar of Neith, the goddess of beginnings. No priest attended her. No ceremony marked the gesture. But she bowed, not in reverence to the statue, but to the act of placing something precious down without claiming it. In the House of Flowers, the girls were gathered for the twilight tea. Tia made space beside her as she arrived and handed her a bowl of hot water infused with cinnamon and clove. "They say the court is restless again," Tia said. "It is the nature of those who fear stillness," Rania replied. "And you?" "I do not fear it. I dwell in it." They drank in silence, and the fire in the hearth cracked, sending up the scent of resin and smoke. Later that night, she lay beneath her linen covering, the bone bird now resting beside her scrolls, the lapis medallion still wrapped in her mother's cloth. She traced the grain of the carved wings with her thumb and thought not of the future, nor of what legacy might rise behind the pharaoh's name. She thought only of stillness, of how something quiet could outlast the wind, of how memory did not need to be spoken, only carried. The palace, as the season crept further towards stillness, began to shed its noise in subtle ways. Fewer processions passed through the outer courtyards. The temple bells rang softer, spaced further apart, their echoes longer. Even the marketplace beyond the walls hushed as the sun lingered lower in the sky. It was the season of remembering, when the dead were honored and the living looked inward. Rania, too, turned inward. She rose before the sun each day, sitting beside the lattice window of her chamber, hands wrapped around a simple clay cup of barley tea, her eyes on the sky as it shifted from indigo to rose. She no longer waited for summons. She listened for presence. When the breeze came through the garden trees, when the guards passed in silence on their morning rounds, when the birds returned to their nesting hollows, these were the signs that guided her now. Her scrolls grew fewer, but deeper. Each one carried more space between the lines, fewer words, more breath. She had learned that saying less often left room for understanding to grow without direction. One morning, Minkau appeared at her door. He carried no scrolls, no stylus, only a small leather pouch and a face made older by fatigue. "The high scribe has died," he said without ceremony. Rania folded her hands over her lap. "He was ill?" "For some time, but he told no one." She stood and stepped aside, letting Minkau into the chamber. He sat by the window, as though the light might carry his words further. "The court will mourn him, yes, but already they are whispering about who will take his place." Rania watched him closely. "I am not a candidate," she said. "No," he agreed, "but they will ask your thoughts on who should be." "Will they listen?" "They already are," he said, "and the one you name will shape the ink of future kings." She returned to her mat and sat across from him. "I will not name anyone," she said gently, "but I will write of what kind of hand should hold that ink." Menkau's eyes softened. "That is enough," he said. That evening, in the queen's chamber, the pharaoh met her in silence. He read the news in her face before she spoke. "I had no love for the high scribe," he said, "but I respected his patience." She poured him a cup of tea, her fingers steady. "Patience and wisdom are not the same." He took the cup. "And you believe we need wisdom now?" "I believe we need silence that has been earned, not silence born from fear, nor from obedience." He nodded. "Then help me find such a voice." She did not answer. She only reached for a fresh scroll and unrolled it across the table. He watched as she wrote, her hand slow and sure. Let the one who follows carry not only the records of law, but the spaces between them. Let him know that what is left unwritten often carries the weight of what is remembered. When she was finished, she handed it to him without a word. He did not thank her. He simply read it again and then again. Later, as the sky darkened into velvet and the palace lamps were lit, she walked alone to the temple of the ancestors. There, beneath the high vault of the outer sanctum, she placed a reed basket filled with herbs, frankincense, basil, rosemary, and blue lotus on the offering stone. She bowed once, pressed her hand to the cool limestone, and whispered the name of no one. The offering was not for the dead. It was for the memory of those who had remained unnamed, for the women whose hands had shaped children who became kings, for the scribes who copied without footnotes, for the silent companions who stood beside power without asking to wear it. When she returned, the house of flowers was quiet. Most of the girls had gone to sleep. Tia was sitting by the low garden wall, her head tilted to the stars. "I saw you leave," she said as Rania passed. "I went to honor what could not be carried forward." Tia nodded, then stood and walked beside her. "Will they give you a title?" she asked. "I don't know." "Will you accept one?" "I don't need it." Tia looked over at her. "Then how will history remember you?" Rania smiled faintly. "Not in name," she said, "but in pause, in the space before decisions, in the silence that steadies a hand before it reaches for power." They parted at the threshold, and Rania stepped back into her chamber, the scent of offering herbs still clinging to her skin. She placed a new scroll on the low table, sat before it in the glow of a single lamp, and wrote, To remain unseen is not to be absent. To remain unnamed is not to be forgotten. There is power in being the pause between kings. The days grew shorter still, and the air turned brittle with the edge of the coming dry season. In the palace, fires burned earlier in the hearths, their smoke winding gently through the halls in pale strands. Sand settled in corners where wind slipped through the stone, and the rhythm of the city slowed into a deep, quiet stillness. In this season, even the river seemed reluctant to move. Within this stillness, Rania remained constant. Her presence had grown familiar, no longer a curiosity, no longer needing explanation. The younger girls in the House of Flowers began to whisper stories about her, not in awe, but in comfort, as one might speak of a gentle flame that never flickered no matter how hard the wind pressed against the walls. Some said she was the voice behind the Pharaoh's calm. Others said she had once been a scribe before becoming a companion. But the truest stories were never told. Rania spent her mornings now walking the gardens before anyone else stirred, placing her palms gently on the tree trunks, listening to the leaves, observing the curl of petals at the edges of fallen blooms. She walked with the ease of someone who no longer waited for permission, not because she felt entitled, but because she had long since learned what it meant to belong without possessing. The Pharaoh, too, had changed. He had become quieter in court. He spoke less in public but acted more swiftly. His reforms were subtle: more bread for the lower fields, better stones sent for the rebuilding of village temples, scribes dispatched to teach in remote settlements. He was carving a legacy not from marble, but from mercy. And still, he returned to her. Their meetings now were not bound by ritual. Sometimes they shared a single cup of water. Other times they walked side by side through empty wings of the palace, saying nothing for long stretches. Words had become unnecessary in most of their moments together. They had created a language without sound. One afternoon, while she copied a scroll in the queen's chamber, a servant arrived with a sealed message. Rania opened it slowly. The seal was that of the Western Temple, the highest order of scribes, guardians of ritual, memory, and the future. The scroll was short. The Council of Archive has requested your presence at the sun's decline. They ask for a reading, not of scripture, of stillness. Rania let the words sit on her lap for several minutes before rising. She dressed in simple linen, wrapped the carved bone bird in cloth, and placed it in her satchel, then walked alone across the long corridor that led to the temple edge. The hall was lined with carved papyrus columns, and as she moved through them, her footsteps echoed like the passing of time itself. At the top of the stairs, 5 elders waited, each dressed in undyed linen, their heads bare, their eyes clear. They offered no introduction, no welcome. They led her into the central sanctum, where the sunlight poured through the open ceiling in a perfect square. The floor beneath was bare stone, no altar, no fire, no throne. "Speak," said the eldest, "not of law, not of kings, not of the gods. Speak of what remains when breath is gone and name is forgotten." Rania stepped into the square of light. The air was warm on her face. The silence in the room held a weight she had come to know well. She looked at each elder and then closed her eyes, and she spoke. In the pause between what is and what is remembered, there lives a stillness, not the stillness of stone, but of breath held in reverence. It is there that choice is shaped, not in noise, not in command, but in listening. She let the silence rise again before continuing. Power that speaks constantly forgets to hear, and in forgetting, it loses its own root. She opened her eyes. "I am not here to carry records. I am here to remind those who write them that silence is not absence, it is presence unshaped, waiting." The elders did not reply, but the youngest among them stepped forward and placed a single stone at Rania's feet. It was smooth, white, unmarked. "You will be added to the archive of the quiet ones," he said. "Your words will be remembered not in ink, but in air, repeated only by those who understand them." She bowed, then turned and left the chamber. By the time she returned to the palace, the sun had dipped behind the outer walls and cast long, sweeping shadows across the gardens. The Pharaoh stood by the reflecting pool, his silhouette dark against the golden light. He turned when he heard her approach. "You were called," he said. "Yes." "And did you answer?" "I did." He stepped toward her and reached for her hand, not to hold it, but to press something into it, a folded piece of palm paper, its surface rough with ink. She opened it. There was no title, no signature, only a single line: "Let the throne learn from the quiet." She looked at him, and he held her gaze with a calm that mirrored her own. That night in her chamber, she placed the white stone beside the lapis medallion and the carved bird. She did not light the lamp. She did not write. She lay down, her hands folded gently across her chest, and let the dark gather around her. She thought not of legacy. She thought only of the breath between now and tomorrow, and how even in silence, a presence could fill the world.